There is a version of this video that would tell you old money families have a secret handshake, a literal test, a checklist behind a velvet rope. That version would be entertaining. It would also be wrong. What actually happens is quieter and, in some ways, more interesting, because it isn't a conspiracy, it's a documented social mechanism. Sociologists have a name for it: boundary work. The process by which established social groups distinguish insiders from outsiders using cues so subtle the outsider often doesn't realize they were being evaluated at all. Old money families don't hand out application forms, but across 3 generations of interviews, memoirs, admission studies, and sociological fieldwork, from Pierre Bourdieu's research on cultural capital to Michel Lamont's work on how the wealthy actually define moral worth, the same 5 evaluative questions surface again and again. Not asked out loud, asked through behavior, and answered before the new person even knows they're being tested. Today we're taking those 5 questions apart, what they really measure, why they evolved, and how they quietly decide who gets let in and who gets smiled at and never called again. Why old money tests at all? Before we get to the 5 questions, we need to answer a more basic one. Why does this vetting process exist at all? The answer isn't snobbery for its own sake, though it can look that way from the outside. The answer is risk management, and it's the same risk management logic that shows up everywhere else in old money behavior, in trust structures, in prenups, in family constitutions. Wealth that has survived multiple generations has, by definition, survived multiple attempts to take advantage of it. Every old money family has a story, sometimes several, about a marriage, a business partner, or a friend who nearly cost the family everything. So the family develops, informally and often unconsciously, a set of screening heuristics. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called the currency being screened for cultural capital, the accumulated knowledge, taste, manners, and unspoken competencies that signal where you actually come from, independent of how much money is in your account right now. Bourdieu's argument, laid out across decades of research in France, was that elites reproduce themselves not primarily through inherited cash, but through inherited dispositions, the ability to move through elite spaces without visibly trying. That's the thing being tested, not your bank balance, your fluency. This distinction matters enormously, and it's the first thing that separates a forensic explanation from a conspiratorial one. The test isn't about money, and it was never designed by any single person. No family patriarch sat down and wrote these 5 rules. They emerged the way etiquette always emerges, through thousands of small social corrections, repeated over generations, until the pattern calcified into instinct. A grandmother doesn't consciously test her granddaughter's new boyfriend. She simply notices things, and what she notices has been shaped by 200 years of her family filtering for the same handful of traits. If you've ever walked into a room and felt like everyone else was fluent in a language you were never taught, that feeling has a name, and we're about to give you the dictionary. Hit subscribe now, because by the end of this video, you'll be able to spot all 5 of these tests happening in real time. Question 1. Do you need this to be impressive? The first unspoken question old money asks of a newcomer is simple to state and hard to fake. Do you need people to know how much this cost? This is the mechanism behind the much-discussed quiet wealth aesthetic, and it long predates the current stealth wealth trend cycle. Economist Thorstein Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption back in 1899 to describe how new money signals status through visible, legible display. But Veblen also noted the inverse. Once a family's status is secure across generations, the signaling need disappears and is often replaced by its opposite. Displaying wealth becomes unnecessary and eventually gauche. It starts to read as insecurity. This is why a family with a 9-figure net worth can drive a 12-year-old station wagon without a flicker of self-consciousness, while a newcomer showing up in a brand new luxury vehicle registers, consciously or not, as trying too hard. It's not that the luxury vehicle is unwelcome, it's that the need for it to be noticed is the tell. Sociologist Michelle Lamont's research on how affluent people construct moral boundaries found something similar. The wealthy she interviewed consistently drew a line between people who were sincere and people who were performing. And that performing, more than the underlying wealth level itself, was what triggered distrust. The newcomer who spends the first 10 minutes of a dinner mentioning 3 vacation homes hasn't failed because of the vacation homes. They've failed because they revealed a need for the group's admiration before they'd earned any trust from the group at all. The practical version of this test looks like: does the newcomer discuss cost, brand, or exclusivity unprompted? Do they know the difference between an heirloom and an acquisition? And can they tell which one they're looking at across the room? Can they compliment something without asking what it cost? This is worth pausing on because it is very easy to overread. This is not a test of frugality. Old money families spend enormous sums of money. What's being tested is whether the spending needs an audience. A family that quietly funds a wing of a hospital and declines the naming opportunity has passed a version of this same test at a civilizational scale. This kind of quiet signaling is exactly the sort of thing we break down in our companion video on the psychology of the $100 million wealth ceiling. Link in the description and comment "quiet" below if you want us to do a full breakdown of stealth wealth dressing next. Question 2. How do you treat people who can't help you? The second question is one that shows up, almost word for word, across dozens of old money memoirs and etiquette manuals stretching back over a century. How do you treat the people who have no power over your future? This one has a mechanical logic that's easy to underestimate. Old money families, especially those who maintain household staff, live in close quarters with people who see everything. And staff talk. Not maliciously, usually, but naturally, the way any workforce discusses the people they work for and around. A newcomer's true character, stripped of the performance reserved for people who matter to their advancement, gets reported back through these informal channels, faster and more accurately than any direct conversation ever could. This mechanism is sometimes called informally the waiter rule, the idea that a person's behavior towards someone who cannot do anything for them is a more reliable signal of character than their behavior towards someone who can. It's not an old money invention. It shows up in hiring folklore across many industries. But old money families have institutionalized it more thoroughly than almost anyone, precisely because their households employ long-tenured staff whose loyalty and discretion the family depends on for generations, and whose read on a newcomer is trusted implicitly. There's a second layer here worth naming honestly. This test also functions as class camouflage detection. Someone who was raised with household help doesn't perform gratitude toward staff as an act. They simply have an ordinary, unremarkable working relationship with the people around them, neither performatively warm nor cold. Someone new to that environment often overcorrects in one of two directions. Either an exaggerated chumminess that staff read accurately as nervous overcompensation, or an entitled coldness that reads as contempt. Both overcorrections are legible to people who have spent their lives around this dynamic, even when the newcomer thinks they're doing well. It's worth being direct about the ethical stakes here too, because this is where old money values and genuinely good values actually overlap rather than diverge. This particular unspoken test, unlike some of the others, rewards a trait worth having regardless of what family you were born into. Basic respect for people, regardless of their utility to you, isn't an old money affectation. It's just decency, and old money happens to have built a very effective, if accidental, detection system for it. If this is the first video of ours you're watching, we go deep into the actual mechanisms behind generational wealth, not the aesthetic, the architecture. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week's video is about how old money families handle the black sheep of the family, and it changes how you'll think about inheritance entirely. Question 3. Can you be bored with us? The third question sounds almost like a trick because it inverts what most newcomers expect. It isn't, can you keep up with an exciting lifestyle? It's, can you tolerate long stretches of nothing happening without needing to fill the silence? This connects to something we've discussed before on this channel, the old money virtue of boredom, but it's worth re-examining specifically as a vetting mechanism rather than just a value. Old money social life, especially at the family level, is often deliberately unglamorous. Long dinners with minimal entertainment, weekends at a family property with no scheduled activities, multi-generational gatherings where the primary event is simply sustained, low-stimulation togetherness. The reason this filters people effectively is that it's very hard to fake enjoying stillness. Someone who is used to a life organized around status, displays, and stimulation will, over a long enough weekend, reveal restlessness, reaching for a phone, steering conversation toward something more exciting, subtly signaling boredom. And old money families, having spent generations cultivating exactly this kind of unhurried, low-key togetherness as both a bonding ritual and a value statement, notice the mismatch immediately. There's a deeper functional reason for this beyond simple compatibility testing. Boredom tolerance correlates in old money's informal folk theory, and to some extent in actual psychological research on delayed gratification and patience, with the ability to sit with long-time horizons, the same trait that underlies century-scale estate planning, illiquid multi-decade investments, and the patience required to let a trust compound across generations without touching it. A family isn't just asking, can you be pleasant company? They're informally, imperfectly, but not irrationally asking, can this person delay gratification the way our money requires us to? It's worth flagging the limits of this one, honestly. This is the softest and most speculative of the 5 mechanisms in terms of direct sociological sourcing. It's more folk wisdom repeated across old money memoirs and family interviews than a peer-reviewed finding. We'll flag that distinction clearly in the fact-check notes. Comment below which of these 5 questions you think you'd fail first. We read every single comment on these videos, and the most common answer might surprise you. Question 4. Do you know what not to say? The 4th question is about discretion, and it's probably the most explicitly taught of the 5, even though it's rarely taught directly. Old money etiquette manuals across the 20th century return again and again to a short list of forbidden dinner table topics: money, health, and other people's business, especially in mixed or unfamiliar company. But the deeper test isn't whether a newcomer already knows the list. Very few people do on arrival. It's how they respond when they slip. Do they recover gracefully, read the room, and redirect? Or do they double down, oversharing further, because they've mistaken the silence for an invitation to fill it? This connects to a broader old money principle we've covered before: privacy as a form of social currency. A family's financial details, health issues, and private conflicts are treated as assets to be protected, not conversation topics to be traded for social connection. A newcomer who asks a direct question about a family's finances, or who volunteers unsolicited detail about their own, isn't just committing a faux pas. They're demonstrating, however innocently, that they don't yet understand which information is currency and which is contraband. There's a generosity worth noting here too, because it would be easy to make this sound purely punitive. Old money families, in the accounts of people who married into them or were adopted into their social circles later in life, often extend real patience to a newcomer's early missteps, provided the newcomer shows they're learning the pattern rather than repeating the mistake. The test isn't never slip, it's notice when you've slipped and adjust. That distinction between a permanent judgment and a trainable skill is part of what keeps this mechanism from being as rigid or cruel as it can sound from the outside. Question 5. Who else vouches for you? The fifth and final question is the most structurally important, because unlike the previous 4, which are about individual behavior, this one is about network position, and it's the one most directly studied by sociologists researching elite reproduction. Old money social ecosystems run substantially on the mechanism of vouching. Historically, this was formalized. Literal letters of introduction required for entry into certain clubs, schools, or social circles, in which an established member staked their own reputation on a newcomer's behavior. The formal letters have mostly disappeared. The underlying mechanism has not. Researchers studying elite boarding schools and old money social networks, notably Peter Cookson and Caroline Purcell's influential study of American prep schools, and later work on elite social capital by scholars like Seamus Khan, found that entry into these networks is rarely a matter of individual merit assessed in isolation. It is relational. Who introduced you? Whose name is attached to your arrival? Whether an established member of the network has effectively put their own social capital on the line for you. This is why old money social circles can seem simultaneously warm to insiders and strangely difficult to penetrate from a cold start. It's not usually active hostility toward newcomers. It's that trust in these networks is transitive, not directly evaluated, meaning the group extends provisional trust to a newcomer largely in proportion to how much trust they already have in whoever brought that newcomer into the room. A newcomer who arrives with a strong vouch starts the other 4 tests with a significant head start. A newcomer who arrives with no vouch at all is often held to a longer, more cautious version of all 4. This is also, worth noting honestly, the mechanism most vulnerable to becoming genuinely exclusionary rather than merely cautious, because it can calcify into circular gatekeeping, where you can only get vouched for by people who were themselves vouched for indefinitely. Several of the sociologists who've studied this dynamic have been explicitly critical of it on exactly these grounds, and we think that critique is fair. Documenting a mechanism is not the same as endorsing it. If you want the full architecture of how old money actually builds and sustains these networks across generations, Not just who gets let in, but how the network itself is engineered to last. We cover that in depth in our video on old money social networks, linked on screen now and in the description. What this means and what it doesn't. So, let's put the 5 tests together plainly. 1. Do you need this to be impressive? 2. How do you treat people who can't help you? 3. Can you be bored with us? 4. Do you know what not to say, and can you recover when you don't? 5. Who else vouches for you? None of these were designed in a boardroom. None of them appear in a rule book. They are the accumulated residue of families that have, across multiple generations, learned, sometimes the hard way, what kind of person tends to be safe to let close to real money, real information, and real family relationships, and what kind of person tends not to be. It's worth ending on the honest complication because this channel's whole premise is mechanism over mythology. These 5 tests are not infallible, and they are not fair in any abstract sense. They systematically favor people who were already raised with proximity to wealth, which is, of course, the point, and also the limitation. Cultural capital of this kind can be learned by outsiders, and history is full of people who did exactly that. But it is learned slowly, through exposure, not through a checklist watched once on YouTube. What we can do here is make the invisible legible. What you do with that legibility is up to you. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. Now you've been taught it. If today's video gave you language for something you'd always sensed but never had words for, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe for the next investigation into how generational wealth actually works. Not the aesthetic, the architecture,